One of the major accomplishments that the League of Nations makes in order to repair the economic situation in Europe, especially with regard to Germany's inability to pay reparations, was the Dawes Plan. All right, so basically the League of Nations puts together this Dawes Plan in 1924, and it's meant to restructure Germany's debt. Basically, the United States is loaning money to Germany so that Germany can pay back the Allies, Britain and France, and then Britain and France will pay back the Allies. So it's a very circular relationship, but still nonetheless very important towards helping the general economic recovery of Europe, but specifically the German economic recovery. So again, kind of funky the way that this works. Now, Germany is the country that is suffering the most prior to the Dawes Plan. It is unable to pay back the Allies, resulting in very negative things like the Ruhr crisis. So basically, the United States decides to lend a bunch of money to Germany, and Germany can therefore pay back some of their reparations to the Allies. Now, why are the Allies paying back the U.S.? Well, remember that the U.S. was neutral up until 1917 in the war, at least in terms of fighting. It wasn't directly sending soldiers, but the U.S. was a huge creditor nation to the Allies during World War I. So countries like Britain and France were borrowing a ton of money from the United States, and ultimately needed to be able to pay them back. So interestingly, because of the Dawes Plan, again, it's this circular relationship. The U.S. is only lending money to Germany so that it eventually can get back money from Britain and France. But nonetheless, very, very important because it helps stimulate German economic recovery. There is the Young Plan, which is instituted in 1929, which is basically continuing the Dawes Plan. But the Great Depression strikes in 1929, which makes the Young Plan moot. Also, very significant that during this time, like we were discussing before with Gustav Stresemann, Germany is going to rejoin the World Community of Nations. All right, so this is one of the biggest accomplishments under Gustav Stresemann's chancellorship. Okay, like I mentioned earlier, 1925, the Locarno Pact. Basically, what this does is it makes it so that Germany and other European nations now have to agree to settle all disagreements peacefully. Okay, the spirit of Locarno, or just in general, peace, was the theme of the Locarno Pact. There are some border disputes that are still lingering from the end of World War I, and those were meant, according to the Locarno Pact, to be settled again in a peaceful way instead of breaking out in war. There are also unresolved borders that are in the east that are meant to be resolved, but more importantly, the idea is for the countries in the west, like Germany, Belgium, France, to settle these any of these disagreements in a peaceful way. Even more interesting of an accomplishment was the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. What this does is it actually says that war is illegal. The only way that war can happen is by self-defense, and 62 nations sign it. But one of the problems with the Kellogg-Briand Pact is, first off, it's overly idealistic. Secondly, how do you ultimately enforce it? The only way ultimately to respond to someone going to war against you is for you to also go to war, right? So, ultimately, even though it is, I guess a good idea in theory to try to prevent any future wars, we know, of course, that the Kellogg-Briand Pact is not going to work on a long term. Another thing that I skipped, but very, very important, is that Germany is able to join the League of Nations also during this time. So again, by the time Gustav Stresemann becomes Chancellor, we see that Germany has significantly improved its status economically, and because of the Dawes Plan, politically because of the Locarno Pact, because it rejoins the League of Nations. Everything seems to be very good for Germany by 1928, 1929 or so. Of course, until the Great Depression, which we'll talk about next time. Okay, how are some other countries doing? Well, France is experiencing some problems after World War I, notably economic. All right, a lot of these economic issues are similar to Germany's. All right, one of the things that it's important for us to realize is that the bulk of fighting on the Western Front took place in France. Right, so France is dealing with the death, devastation, and debt of World War I, so it creates a lot of economic chaos. It's creating some political unrest, right? France was still, its government was made up of a multi-party system, as you should be familiar with, but it's important to realize that in the 1920s, mostly rightist or conservative parties were controlling France. So what they're trying to do is support the status quo. Businesses are supporting them, armies are supporting them, the church is also supporting them. So, you know, we could argue, we could think about how effective this conservative government is in helping France's economy recover. There is some serious, there are serious inflation problems and deficit problems in 1926 that actually cause the Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré to be recalled back to office, and he institutes some economic plans that include slashing spending and raising taxes. And this does actually really help France's economy. It helps restore the stability of the franc. Helps encourage not government spending, but just general consumer spending. Again, confidence in the economy is one of the most significant ways to ultimately recover from some sort of economic crisis. So actually, the question I asked before, how effective are the conservatives in dealing with economic problems in France, they actually were pretty successful. So the franc, thanks to Raymond Poincaré's economic policies, remained stable until about 1930 when the Depression strikes. Okay, how's Britain doing? Notably, Britain is making some significant significant accomplishments socially. We discussed in a previous chapter how Britain was increasingly opening up the franchise, particularly towards women. Note that there were two Representation of the People's Acts, one in 1918, which gave women over 30 the right to vote, and then 1928, the Representation of the People's Act gave all women over 21 the right to vote. So by 1928, you have basic universal suffrage between men and women, which is a huge social accomplishment. But the continued lingering problem in Britain is not so much social, but it is economic. There is still a significant gap between the rich and the poor. The concentration of wealth in Britain was geared more towards the top than any other country in Europe. All right, the top 1% of the population owned 2/3 of the national wealth. And so this unevenness between the rich and the poor was one of the most significant problems that Britain had to deal with in the post-World War I period. One of the biggest problems that was facing Britain that relates to this gap between rich and poor is the problem of unemployment. All right, a lot of this is because after World War I ends, the sort of guaranteed employment that wartime production demands is obviously going to go away. So all these economic losses, all these job losses is going to result in significant problems with unemployment, and there are going to be also some social upheavals that result from these economic issues as well. Most notably, the general strike of 1926. So the way this happens, so there are miners in Britain that are worried that they're going to experience some significant drops in their wages. Their wages already were low, and they're afraid that they're going to drop even more. Okay, so they start to strike in 1926. And then what starts to happen, which is why it's called a general strike, is that the workers across the country, not just miners, but workers in all fields, are also going to strike. We would call these sympathetic strikes, right? Basically, they feel that their strike will have much more weight if it's not just among the miners, but it's among all members of the working class, right? This basically, it's significant because it's shutting down all economic productions. But unfortunately for the workers, the strike actually eventually fails, and the government's going to take measures in the future to outlaw subsequent sympathetic strikes. All right, so they don't want this to happen anymore. They don't want, sort of a social upheaval to ultimately result in complete and utter shutdown of economic production. All right, so the general strike is kind of an exception. In general, in the 1920s, we don't see that much social unrest. Sorry, that's a little bit cut off there, but that just says unrest there. Okay, so Britain also is going to take significant measures after World War II World War I, that is, to become a welfare state. All right, like Germany, who was the pioneer, Britain is going to provide unemployment benefits. It's going to subsidize housing. It's going to apply medical aid and old age pensions to the general population. All right, now, the party that is much more in favor of these kind of social welfare policies is the Labour Party, which is going to briefly take power in the parliament in 1924. It's going to hold the majority in the parliament for just a brief period, a 9-month period in 1924. It's going to be led by Ramsay MacDonald. And the Labour Party, they're committed to what is called revisionist socialism. We talked about this back in chapter 25. Remember that unlike Marxists, revisionist socialists believe that change can come slowly over time, right? That, ultimately it is a gradual process for the working class to benefit and be on a more equal pairing with the middle class, right? Move towards socialism gradually and democratically is what the Labour Party stands for. All right, as time goes on, we're going to see that the Labour Party is going to become powerful enough to emerge as the main opposition party to the Conservatives. Before the Labour Party, it was the Liberal Party that was the opposing party to the Conservatives. So we kind of see that that the opposing party is actually becoming a little bit more leftist. All right, so we are going to see though that the Conservative Party is going to fairly quickly regain power over the Labour Party. Part of this is because they label the Labour Party as communist, pro-communist, because the Labour Party actually did recognize the legitimacy of the Soviet Union, so the Conservatives kind of take advantage of some Red Scare feelings to regain party in Parliament. But nonetheless, unlike other governments, the Conservatives actually do continue social reforms even after they take power. All right, the new Prime Minister here is Stanley Baldwin. All right, he rules Britain between 1924 and 1929. Again, he is pretty compromising in terms of accepting and trying to kind of remedy social issues. All right, he's open to reform for female suffrage, which shows, again, it was 1928 that the Representation of the People's Act was enacted. We also see that he is in favor of expanding pensions to people like widows, orphans, and the elderly. And in general, under Stanley Baldwin's rule, we have a sense of optimism emerging throughout Britain. All right. One of the continuing problems, though, in Great Britain in general was what to do with Ireland. Remember that there was a push towards Irish independence, Irish home rule under William Gladstone that we had discussed earlier, again in chapter 25. So the Irish independence question was sort of put on hold during World War I, but again, it has to be re-examined once the war is over. Okay, so the Easter Rebellion actually took place during the war. If we remember, it was 1916. A lot of pro-Irish Republicans didn't really want to wait until the war was over and stage rebellion. The Sinn Féin, which was a pro-Irish Republican group, was responsible for bringing on the Easter Rebellion. However, the Easter Rebellion was put down by the English army. Right, and then you're going to see a civil war break out in Ireland. It's also called the Irish War for Independence, and this takes place between the Irish Republican Army, who are pro-Irish independence, and the English Black and Tan Force. All right, and despite the fact that England's military is much more powerful, by October of 1921, they do create the Irish Free State. Ultimately, what happens is that Northern Ireland, or the Ulster provinces up here, they're going to opt out of joining the Irish Free State, partly because Northern Ireland is much more heavily Protestant and Southern Ireland is Catholic. All right. In 1922, you're going to have Ireland get full autonomy because Britain was unable to suppress all these guerrilla conflicts that were breaking out throughout Ireland. So by 1922, you have Irish independence, significant accomplishment for Ireland right after World War I. So it shows us a significant degree of instability in Great Britain, but ultimately how it was resolved relatively peacefully. Last but not least, we're going to see that the British Empire, the age of imperialism, the British Empire is going to start to shrink. Its protectorate in Egypt is going to end, all right, but it is going to maintain control of the Suez Canal. You're also going to see that the British dominions, both Canada and Australia, instead of ruling them, so to speak, Canada basically makes these dominions equal. Canada, what did I mean? I meant Britain. Britain makes these areas equal to Britain, right? So this is going to be a significant accomplishment in making Britain less of an empire as we used to know it.